This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is 1944. Dog Company, the boys of Pointe du Hoc, the Rangers who accomplished D-Day's toughest mission and led the way across Europe. I welcome the author, Patrick K. O'Donnell. We go immediately to London. It's early 1944. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder and his executive officer, Major Max F. Schneider, are reporting to Omar Bradley's office in London. They get off the train at Paddington Station and walk over and are introduced through a Colonel Truman Thorson to a mission labeled Top Secret. Patrick, congratulations. And this story remains vivid more than 10 years after you first published. And I welcome your return here to talk about the details. All these men of the Rangers are gone now, to my understanding. And yet the scale of this challenge in D-Day and then afterwards across France, across Belgium into Germany defies easy encapsulation. So we tell the story from Top Secret. What was the mission that Rudder and Schneider met that day? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. It's great to be back. And this for me is a sacred story. I've written many books on World War II, 7 in all, focusing on the elite units. And these men were my friends, many of the men of Dog Company. I got to know them. My daughter grew up with these uncles of World War II, the great heroes of D-Day. And, for me, it was a very special thing to be able to tell their story. And I had known them. I interviewed them in the 90s and the 2000s I've known them for a long time. And their story that was being discussed there in that office was the most dangerous mission of D-Day. They had to take out 6 large guns that could either be pointed at Omaha Beach or Utah Beach or at the invasion itself. And they had to be taken out at all costs. And the challenge was that they would have to scale a 90-foot cliff. Straight up, they would be going right into the teeth of German defenses in a frontal assault to scale these sheer 90-foot cliffs under direct machine gun fire, artillery fire, mortar fire, and even suspended IEDs that were hanging on the cliff from old French artillery shells that the Germans could detonate. And when they got there, they were just aghast that this was their mission. And one of the men remarked that somebody with a broom could literally sweep them off the top of that cliff as they were trying to climb it.
Where the Rangers come from. They've been training since 1943. What was the concept that the U.S. Army proposed to train the second Ranger Battalion, the 1st Ranger Battalion, the Rangers in total? What did they want them for, Patrick?
John, this is in 1941, if we could step back, the United States Army did not have special operations units at all. And this is a concept that was foreign to us. We had pretty much conventional military, and there was a real thinking within the Army that this would be bleeding off good men for the regular combat units. So overnight, America had to develop special operations units, and that was led. The main force of that was the Office of Strategic Services. This is Wild Bill's group, Donovan's group. They have a special operations branch, and they begin to pioneer things. And then several branches of this special operations tree for America. There's the Rangers, and this has a tradition in America that stretches back to Robert's Rangers and even before. And then you have Mosby's Rangers, but there's also British commandos. And Colonel Truscott was given the task of coming up with a name, and he said, Eisenhower said anything but commando. And the word Ranger has a very important role in American history. And we have a very proud tradition of irregular warfare in America. And the name Ranger was used. And we have first Darby's Rangers, which begins in 1942. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 4th Ranger Battalions have quite a storied history in North Africa, beginning with the landings in Sicily, and then also moving up the boot into Italy. The Rangers, Derby's Rangers, suffer incredible losses at the Pantino Ditch in Anzio, where they are nearly surrounded and annihilated by the Hermann Göring Division. Few Rangers survive. It's a massive casualties. They fight to the death in many cases. And it's an incredible story that I tell in my book, Beyond Valor, where I interviewed some of these Rangers for the first time on Anzio. But the Ranger concept moves forward, and they bring out the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and which is the focus of Dog Company, my book, and the 5th Ranger Battalion. And Max Schneider, who's with Rudder at this meeting, was an officer with Derby's Rangers. He has combat experience, and he's really quite a remarkable individual in and of himself. But he had some very serious injuries from landings in Sicily and in Italy, and PTSD, arguably. And it's questionable whether or not he can make it. And Eisenhower himself literally intercedes to make sure that Max Schneider is there on that mission, even though he wants to go home because he's suffering very seriously from his injuries.
The mission is laid out to them. Their 1st and 2nd and 3rd response is impossible. The Rangers have arrived in Great Britain, late in the year of 43. They sailed on the Queen Elizabeth. I was struck by the fact that the Queen Elizabeth sailed without escort. So they veered back and forth across the North Atlantic. Of course, the wolf packs were very thick at that point, and the only protection they had was the QE thought it could outrun any German submarines. Of course, that doesn't say it could outrun a German submarine in front of it, but in any event, they are training for this mission. The men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion and the companies A through F, we're going to concentrate on Dog Company, and several individuals, very vivid throughout the fight, who survive all of these missions. And Patrick speaks with them towards the end of their lives. Having lived full lives, they reflect on these events with sharp memories that Patrick compares to the after-action reports. In the training, Patrick, because they're climbing what cliffs they can find, and they're climbing them at speed. There's a photograph that appears on the front of Patrick's book that shows one of the training missions charging across and going up the scale. What did they believe of their prospects in training for it, climbing day after day? Did they adjust their tactics in any fashion?
This is really, in many ways, remarkable training, John. These men conducted their training under live fire, and actual rounds were being fired in the distance. In this picture, you can actually see rounds that were going off, and there were casualties from the live fire. But for several months, these men would climb any cliff they could find. And they were 500 feet high, in some cases 400 feet high. And these guys were climbing the cliffs without safety harnesses, just ropes. And there were several instances where the Rangers literally fell off the cliff. And one remarkable story is a guy by the name of Rondeau falls off a cliff that's 200 feet high, but lands in soft sand and just miraculously survives. But on top of the cliff, the Ranger officers were using their M1 Garands and literally firing down on the Rangers, obviously missing them. But they wanted to give their men the real feel and sensation of what it was like to go through, actual bullets flying as they were climbing up these cliffs. And the training was extremely rigorous and very realistic and very demanding. And these men were ready when they were there on D-Day.
Let's go to D-Day. It's the 6th of June, suddenly, with Patrick K. O'Donnell The book is Dog Company, The Boys of Pointe du Hoc, the Rangers who accomplished D-Day's toughest mission and led the way across Europe. We've spoken of many instances over the last years about events that seem impossible in retrospect in the history of American warfare. This one, I believe, is the top of the list. It is 4:05 a.m., 6th of June, 1944. The Rangers are given a simple order: man your boats. At this point, the artillery barrage from the fleet is going into D-Day, Normandy, this vast canvas over 50 miles, and all these divisions are getting ready to land. The critical juncture from the point of view of Omar Bradley, Commander, Eisenhower, overall Chafe Commander, is Pointe du Hoc, because those German guns there can destroy the advantage that the Allies have with the surprise on Normandy. And the Germans are surprised. They expected the landing to come well to the west at Pas-de-Calais. The Rangers man their boats, and at this point, Patrick, we need to discuss how Rudder imagined the trip. There are three elements: Force A, Force B, Force C. Force A we're going to stay with because that's where Dog Company is. What was the original intent of Force B and Force C, and what were their orders, Patrick?
The other forces' orders were the main objective is Pointe du Hoc, and it's these guns. There's a common myth that the guns weren't, quote, there. In reality, they were not in the casements, and the Germans had moved these large guns into a apple orchard, which is about 700 yards from the casements, but they were there and they were very much ready to go. So they had to be neutralized, and the Allies used everything at their disposal to take out these guns. They bombed and plastered Pointe du Hoc with bombing missions for over a month. They shore bombarded it with heavy artillery from the fleet. Nothing could take out these guns, and it was up to on the shoulders of the Rangers to take them out. And the original force was which included Dog Company, which was roughly 3 companies of Rangers, and their mission was to initially scale the cliff and basically have a toehold. And the 5th Ranger Battalion was then going to come on as a reinforcement to finish the job and then move inland. Their first objective was to take out these guns. The second objective was to basically cut the coastal road that linked Omaha and Utah Beach, and then dig in up there and prevent any kind of traffic from moving across the road. And it was then that the 5th Ranger Battalion would move in and reinforce it if everything went well.
So we have Force A, Dog, Easy, and Fox, to assault the cliffside. Force B, which I have my note here, is Charlie Company and the Mortar Battalion are to take off another point where there are heavy weapons, not big guns, but heavy weapons.
They're heavy mortars, yes.
Force C, that's Abel Baker Headquarters and 5th Ranger Battalion. They're there to be the second wave, the reinforcement once the initial assault is made. That's the plan as they move in towards the beaches under this gunfire. But as we both know, Patrick, that day, the coxswains who were in charge of the boats, there were different scales of boats, could not or did not allow for the heavy draft of the sea pushing them to the west. And also there was a particular problem on the landing craft assigned to the Rangers, something about their radar. Was it their radar? There was something was broken.
Yeah, this is where small details in history literally could change the course of history. And this is what happened. Somewhat miraculously that morning, a Lieutenant Beaver who was piloting the lead boat had some mechanical issues with the radar. So he proceeded to the wrong point. He proceeded to Force B's objective, Pointe de la Place, which was also a cliff mass that had these heavy mortars. And they get there, but their timetable is blown by 30 or 40 minutes. But what happens here is it also saves the Rangers because a force of A-20 bombers came over the point and it was late. And they dropped their bombs on the point as well as the sea that was right in front of Point du Hoc. So had they been on time, the entire landing craft assault for Force A probably would have been destroyed by our own bombs. But they're off schedule. And they then turn around and go to the correct point, which is Point du Hoc, and they open up the doors on the landing craft. And Leonard Lomell, who's the main character of Dog Company, literally steps out into a shell hole that's 10 feet deep and goes under his head into the shell hole as he then walks across the shell hole into the point, and they start to scale the cliff, which is extremely dangerous. But what also happens here is that a radio message from James Eichner is also not received by the 5th Ranger Battalion, and they proceed to their secondary objective. It's Lieutenant Gambosi's helmet, which I have right back here. It's a painted helmet with gas-resistant paint, and he was wearing that on D-Day. He was the communications officer for the 5th Ranger Battalion. Did not receive the most important message, and they proceed to their secondary objective, which is Omaha Beach. Max Snyder is leading it, and they change the whole course of history because they are exactly at the right time, at the right place, as Omaha Beach at that time is stalled and hung up. And there's really a plan to potentially basically disembark from the beach and go back on the ships. So, I mean, things are so precarious there. So these mistakes change the course of history. And that's why the Point du Hoc operation is so important, because not only do they neutralize the guns, but the secondary objective takes place in the 5th Ranger Battalion.
Right.
Lands on
It's the 29th Division on the right side, the east side of Omaha, and the Assistant Division Commander, Norm Cota, gathers around him the Rangers who have incorrectly landed there thinking that they were not needed at Point du Hoc. And Cota gathers Rangers around him and it says, let's bow the wire. And they clear that portion of Normandy. But meanwhile, we've got to go back to the original mission, because Assault A, Dog, Easy, and Fox are unaware that they do not have a backup, that they're isolated. So their initial charge up is only to secure the cliffside and find the guns. They certainly don't have enough men to hold off what they can expect to be the German counterattack, which will come over the next days. The book is Dog Company, The Boys of Point du Hoc, the Rangers who accomplished D-Day's toughest mission and led the way across Europe. It is 6th of June, sometime around between 7:20 and 8 o'clock in the morning. The landing craft are all coming into Omaha and Utah at this point. Also, there's the British and Canadian and French forces landing further to the west. However, all of that is vulnerable to those German guns at the top, and they must be destroyed. The assault is led by Assault Team A, Dog, Easy, and Fox. They've been training for this, and they have a machine that is new to assault forces anywhere. I don't know that they needed it before. It's a grapnel hook fired by a rocket. Patrick, my memory of your detail is that it was to be launched from the landing craft. Is that correct, or did they carry them to the shoreline?
Most of them were launched from the landing craft, and it was a rocket-propelled grapnel, as you mentioned, which shot the rope up. But this was a tenuous situation. Most of these ropes were literally wet from the seawater on the land as they were coming into the landing craft, because from the top of the cliff, the Germans were, using mortar rounds and hand grenades, potato masher hand grenades, and things were, there was a lot of chaos in the landing area, and it was very rough and tumultuous. So these men, they fire the grapnels and they start to climb up the cliffs. And part of the cliff face is the shore bombardment, as well as the bombardment from the bombers had collapsed part of the cliff, which made it difficult, but also in some cases a little bit easier to climb. but they still had to go up this cliff against machine gun fire from MG-42s, which could fire an astounding rate of almost 1,500 rounds per minute when they were fully operational. And the Germans were feeding belt after belt into their machine guns. They were, lobbing hand grenades as the Rangers were scaling the cliff. And this is really, truly one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II. And like many of my books, the story rests upon the individual or the individual combat soldier, which works on his own initiative. And an individual can literally change the course of an invasion. And that's certainly the case with my main character in this book, Master Sergeant Len Lomell, who's scaling the cliff at this time. And Len is shot through the side by an MG-42 bullet. And, he goes into the shell hole as he goes out the ramp of the landing craft, climbs the rope, he's shot in the side with an MG-42 bullet, and he continues to scale the cliff, makes their way to the top. And the top of Pointe du Hoc is like the surface of the moon. There's so much ordnance that was thrown on there from the bombers, from the shore bombardment, from the ships, that everything is cratered. Many of the bunkers up there, and you can see this to this day, are collapsed and massive structures that are heavily damaged. And this, in some ways, it benefits the defenders up there. They're able to use this rubble and wreckage to their advantage. And the Rangers have to fight through this maze, this fortress on top, effectively, which is, there's also a 37 millimeter cannon. It's part of an anti-aircraft defense for the point that is, fully operational, and they're firing upon the Rangers. And the Rangers literally have to fight through this maze up top of the point. And the defenders are using the underground labyrinth of tunnels and bunkers to their advantage as they fight the Rangers. And Lomell gets to the casement that he is assigned to, and he finds a telephone pole in place of the guns in the casement. And this is the case with all the casements. The Germans knew the point was going to get plastered. So they took the guns and moved them from the most obvious place, which is casements, to an apple orchard. And they put nets over the guns to hide them. And Lomell then, goes to, all of these men are trained for the objective. They don't have to rely on orders. They know what to do. And this is something that's very important with American combat personnel in World War II, and even to this day. They're trained for the mission, and they're trained to basically go towards that objective without orders or whatever, and improvise if necessary. And Lomell looks on the ground and he finds tire tracks for the guns and starts following them. And literally he and his close friend, Sergeant Jack Kuhn, follow these tire tracks, and they have to fight through a series of bunkers that are along the way, and they make their way towards the orchard, and they make their way towards where the guns are hidden and located.
And they begin the idea, the motion of destroying the guns. I want to include one other team that's going to come in several days later. Who is Slater, and what happens to his boat?
This is the focus of my book is Dog Company. It's effectively a band of brothers on the Rangers in their story. And Dog Company accomplishes the mission of Pointe du Hoc with half of its personnel, roughly, because from the start, the boat that Slater and the company commander and the executive officer are in is hit by a near miss from a shell, and it capsizes the entire boat. And these men are forced to somehow swim in the rough seas and waters of the channel, and many of them die and perish in those cold waters, including one of the men that miraculously survived a fall from a 300-foot cliff during training, Rondo, who One of my other main characters, Ruggiero, who's a very good friend of mine, who's a fire chief up in Massachusetts, who is a tap dancer. He's 5'3", one of the shortest or smallest rangers there. He had a life belt that was defective, and he talked to Lomell about it right before the invasion. Said, "Get rid of it, get a new one, throw it out the window of the port window of the ship." And Rondo stopped him and said, I need my belt. I lost mine. And he said, "No, you really need to get a new one." But he put the defective belt on, and he tried to use it that day on D-Day, and very unfortunately perished, even after surviving a 300-foot fall from a cliff months earlier. But that boat is capsized, and they don't come into play on D-Day.
Right, but that team will be important to reinforce in coming days. Now, a detail here. They get to the top. The top, if you visit it today, which I recommend to everyone, you'll see that there are trench lines and reinforced bunkers and communication trenches leading this way and that way, similar to World War I. In that instance, you can move between strong points without exposing yourself. There are shell holes everywhere. There is particularly one gun, an anti-aircraft gun, a 37 millimeter, that has not been taken and plays across the landscape for the rest of that day and keeps their heads down. So they're operating under fire all the time. Do I describe that correctly, Patrick?
Absolutely, John. I mean, the Germans are still in force on top of Pointe du Hoc, and they're very well armed. They still have plenty of ammunition. They're holed up in these bunkers, and they're fighting the Rangers tooth and nail on top of the point. And it's Lomell and Kuhn and others that break out from the casements, and they might make their way towards it's Lomell and Kuhn that make their way really towards that apple orchard. And each of these men are armed with what's known as a thermite grenade. And the thermite is, it basically heats up at a very, very high temperature, creates a molten like lava, almost like substance. And Lomell finds the guns, and remarkably, the crews of those guns are assembled, and they're listening to an officer giving them orders. It's unknown what they were, but as the guns were literally unprotected for a few minutes, and it's here that Lomell takes these thermite grenades and places them on the gears of the guns, and literally welds or molds the molten lava from the grenades, renders them inoperable. And they accomplish the mission. It's really two men, really one man, that accomplishes the mission of the entire initial force, which is a remarkable thing. It's something that these bombers, hundreds of bombers couldn't accomplish. The shore bombardment of the heavy guns of the Texas and other ships couldn't accomplish. The single individual is able to change or shape the course of the invasion through his own efforts, and he's wounded as well.
It's the evening of June 6th. Dog, Easy, and Fox Company are now displayed across Pointe du Hoc. The Germans continue to fire at them. The guns are destroyed, and they're waiting for their reinforcements. Remember, Force C, which is now broken through off of Omaha and made the first effort into France, is not available. The orders finally come through, hold until relieved. And when we come back, that's going to mean several days without reinforcements. And the German counterattack is ferocious. Patrick K. O'Donnell, he is the author of Dog Company, The Boys of Pointe du Hoc, the Rangers who accomplished D-Day's toughest mission and led the way across Europe. They're going to begin the way across Europe by withstanding German counterattacks. The textbook for the German army, the Wehrmacht, and their many superior units in and around France at this point, was that you absorb the enemy's offensive and then you must counterattack immediately. I'm told it was like clockwork. You knew they were coming, and they come with their whistles blowing, an overwhelming force. Dog, Easy, and Fox are now arrayed in a defensive line as close to the guns where the guns were displayed as possible on a highway that connects Omaha and Utah Beach. The guns were right in the middle. They could rain on both of them. Patrick, the counterattacks, they know they're coming, and it's the morning of June 7th. Rudder, the commander of the 2nd Battalion Force, is at the cliffside, not as separated by, I think you said, about a mile from the defensive line of Dog. Is that correct? Dog was facing towards the east because they were expecting the attack to come from the east. All correct?
Yes, that's correct. Dog and the other companies, most of the men were they were still deployed on top of the cliff fighting the Germans. And then they also had whatever members they could spare. They charged towards the coastal road, which is their secondary objective. And they dug in kind of an L shape for a pattern with, very like the shallow shell holes, trenches, if you will, however they could. And they dug in kind of within these hedgerows near the road. And it was that night that the Germans counterattacked very significantly. In company strength, hundreds of men charged the Rangers' positions, and they overwhelmed one of the personnel from one of the companies that was up there. They took them out. Several men were captured. Many men were killed. And it's a very ferocious counterattack that overwhelms that L-shaped position. But Dog Company still stands. They're dug in, facing the road itself, and they're there, and they remain there. But many men fall back into the positions from E and F Company. And one of my main characters is a guy by the name of Earl Petty, who loses part of his teeth and kind of walks with a bit of a waddle, but he's just an amazing combat soldier. He has a BAR, Browning automatic rifle, and he's helping his men as they're falling back in disarray. And Petty was there, along with many of the other men that I interviewed, Hermstein, for instance, and others. And it's back at the command bunker that other than Dog Company, the men are holding the point, and they're barely hanging on. They have an observer, Lieutenant Colonel Trevor, who's with them, and he turns to Rudder, and Rudder asks him, what's their chances? And he basically says, I've never felt more in the belief that I'd be a prisoner the next day or dead. And this is a man that had gone through, had been in the British Armed Forces since the beginning of the war as a Royal Commando, I should say, and had been through everything. And his assessment was very bleak and dire. He has this, there's quite a bit of backstory with him. He has this like little one step that he does with a cane. It's right out of a movie. And he believes that the German bullets can't hit him until a MG-42 bullet drills a hole right through the center of his helmet. But he survives. And he is with Rudder that night, and they're barely hanging on. To the point, which is about to be overwhelmed by these Germans. But the
E Company
Rangers are tenacious.
E Company is rolled up. I have Petty finding a paratrooper who's drifted off from where he was supposed to land. So they gathered what people they can around them. It's important to consider
there were paratroopers there. Petty was a paratrooper in the sense that he went through training but broke his legs. And then is kind of washed out, but goes into the Rangers and goes through training and has to fight through training, and he does make it. And he's one of the great Rangers of D-Day. There were some other paratroopers that also landed near the point, and they would fight. They were from the 82nd and the 101st, and they would fight with the Rangers.
Right. They were gathering what Americans they could find.
Anything they could.
Because the Germans were sending wave after wave. They wanted to retake the point. It was a focus for the overall command to hold on to D-Day. The plans here are to crack Omaha Beach, and that was nearly accomplished on that first day. It's now June 7th, and the USS Texas guns That's the big battleship that survived Pearl Harbor when it's renovated, are weighed on Pointe du Hoc to destroy what they can of the German resistance, especially that anti-aircraft gun. But we need to get on to the rescue because it is now June 8th, I believe, right? This is hedgerow territory. You can't see anything. You walk down a road, you can't see to your right or left. There's an enormous overgrown hedgerow. They're beautiful, but they're impenetrable. And that's why it's possible for 12 men in dog company right now. I have 12 men on their own in dog company withstanding the German counterattacks. But up the road comes tanks, and I believe somebody thought we're done now because the Germans are bringing in their good stuff. But the tank was an American tank led by the commander Canham. Is that right? Colonel Canham of the 116th.
Yeah, this is several days later. It's around the 8th, and the
June 8th,
Americans in the 5th Ranger Battalion had broken through at Omaha. They were the first groups to break through, but now they're being used as the relief force to relieve the 2nd Ranger Battalion or the Force A on top of Pointe du Hoc. And the Rangers on Pointe du Hoc were so low on American ammunition that they were using German ammunition and German MG-42s, anything they could get their hands on. And they were firing out these tanks who they thought were German vehicles that were coming to assault them. And the Americans on the other side thought that they were facing German adversaries because they had these captured weapons they didn't know. And one of the most telling comments that I got was, some of our toughest combat was from fellow Americans. That's what the Rangers told me, because they were fighting each other literally for about less than an hour, and they were fighting each other, and there were friendly fire casualties. Eventually, it was understood that these were American forces that were coming through, and the link up was complete. But there were casualties from that friendly fire, and the tenacity of Americans fighting one another is the really telling line from the oral histories that I conducted, hundreds of oral histories.
Duke Slater does now rejoin with what's left of his command. This is from June 10 through June 19. So the dog company is reunited, and they're about to be given another mission, which is equally daunting. And yet the resolution of the next mission is an example of what Patrick has emphasized. You're on your own out there. You know what the mission is, and any way you can accomplish it is fine with us. We're about to take capture an overwhelming German force with bravado. That's what's next. The book is Dog Company, The Boys of Pointe du Hoc. The first mission is satisfied. Now the Rangers are on to other missions that seem impossible when you hear about them. Patrick K. O'Donnell is the author. It is now late summer, 1944. The Rangers have been on several trips in different directions, including being guards for German POWs and taking what you'd have to say is a break between their impossible mission on D-Day and now another impossible mission given them by command. If I understand Patrick's presentation correctly, the Allies needed a big port, and the Germans knew it. So they were destroying what port facilities at Cherbourg existed, and they were holding off at Caen. This will be a problem for the Allies across forward into 45, the long tail, and they need a big port. Brest, the port behind their lines, cut off now from reinforcements by Germany. Brest is a fortress that Hitler orders to hold till the end at all costs. The Rangers are part of a unit given the impossible task of assaulting minefields and heavy guns and a dug-in garrison of good troops commanded by overall commanders who are in communication with Germany, hold at all costs, destroy the facility. Again, the Rangers know that their mission here is unlikely, except we come to September 6th. There's some big gun units here too. The Graf Spee guns, which can destroy ships at sea, so you can't get too close. The Germans have prepared this to survive forever. And the Allies don't want to leave it behind their lines. Patrick, Lieutenant Edlin is a star. He's a man with charm. What is his mission that day against the fortress at Brest?
His mission is to sort of scout out the position and see if there's a weakness or a hole. And the Fabulous Four, this is Edlin and his three other scouts, move forward, and they notice a path within the minefield. It looks like it's been used by a local to get food, maybe to the fort or something. Edlin just uses his intuition to move along this and move through a massive belt of minefield, which is, there's bouncing betties everywhere. Literally, things come out of the ground. They come about 5 feet up, and they spray shrapnel and ball bearings and shred people. I mean, it's a very deadly type situation. And then there's machine guns all over the place. They sort of go low to the ground. They make their way through this on this path, and they get to the door of this massive gun battery. Kind of picture the guns of Navarone, but the guns are largely submerged. There's a massive building that's underground to support large battleship size 12-inch guns that can strike out into the channel anywhere around Brest and knock out Allied ships. And these gun batteries have been turned back towards the attacking Ranger forces. And these shells have, the size of a freight car, basically. Feels like that's the men say. They're able to vaporize this small hill because they have so much firepower. And the Rangers have been, sustaining attacks from these massive guns as they push towards the forts and push towards Brest. Edlin is able to get inside the fort, and he's able to present himself in front of the commanding officer of the fort. He's taken there, and the officer is very nonchalant about it. They don't check the Rangers for all their weapons. And Edlin has a hand grenade in his pocket, and the commanding officer, rather than first, says, "What do you want?" basically. And at that point, Edlin springs over the desk of this German officer and throws his grenade at his chest and says, "If you don't surrender the entire fort, I'm going to blow you up along with myself." And the commanding officer is just so struck by this sudden movement, the audacity of Edlin, that they surrender the entire Locust battery. Over 200, 300 men, Germans surrender. And it's an incredible thing that's documented in Lieutenant Edlin's Distinguished Service Cross that he receives as they surrender the battery that day. It's an amazing story.
The other detail I like that you remind us of is that Canham, the commander of the 116th, who is now in charge of the force that's meant, the Rangers are part of a larger force, meant to take Brest, arrives to talk to the German commander, overall commander of the fortress. And the overall commander is condescending towards Canham, who's arrived that day looking like a regular GI, though he's in command of this large force. And he asks him about his credentials. How does it go, Patrick?
I think he turns around and says, "My credentials are back here. All the men that I command."
Yes, he says, "These are my credentials." And Brest is surrendered without excessive casualties, although the attempts to cross those minefields and assault Brest did cause casualties. This introduces a topic that Patrick's now going to take us to, because I liked Edlin's story. Rangers find a way, right, Patrick? They find a way.
Rangers lead the way. They find the way. And
we're about to go to a place that is not much written about, where the Rangers are assigned. And we have a chance here to set up what's about to happen, because the impossible mission on D-Day is to be followed by an even much more impossible mission in the Hürtgen Forest. What was the Hürtgen Forest, and what were the mistakes made about it, Patrick?
Yeah, this is a factory of death. as those that fought there described it. It was death on an industrial scale. The Allies had lost, nearly the number of casualties that we lost in the entire Korean War in the Hürtgen forest. It was a forest that was heavily defended, heavily mined, heavily bunkered. The Germans had prepared very carefully positions with flanking fire from machine guns, from different anti-tank guns, anything that they want, mortars zeroed in on, and artillery zeroed on in areas that it was very, very difficult to advance in this forest. And instead of bypassing it, which is what the Allies, encircling it and bypassing, the Allies should have done, the American forces went through the forest and tried to capture it. And it was a disaster that would take months and many, many casualties.
This is late in 44, and it's part of the so-called Siegfried Line that was meant to be the final defensive line for Germany. In other words, the Allies have crossed France, they've crossed Belgium, and November and December, they're ready to push their way into Germany, thinking that the German resistance has collapsed and that there's nothing between them and Berlin to end this story by Christmas time. And Patrick's going to take us into the Hürtgen forest with the Rangers, because of course, the Rangers, we need that detail, Patrick. The Rangers are always attached to a corps or an army. They're special troops.
They're the reserve at this point, Corps Reserve, and they're used for special missions. In the event that there's a breakthrough, for instance, they would be used to stem that tide, or in a special mission to facilitate a breakthrough. And that's certainly what they have in mind here. It's a meat grinder. The Hürtgen forest is a disaster. Beginning in September, it's one casualty after another, and the towns of the forest are heavily defended. There's also a series of dams in the Rudder River, and the objective really should have always been to capture those dams, but the Allies don't realize that. They just keep pushing through this meat grinder, and more casualties men and units are just shredded in this place. And there's it's the Rangers that are arriving on the scene. They're fighting in this kind of hellish landscape in these small towns, but they're kept in reserve for the most part until December 6th, when a combat command of an armored division, which is a portion of that division, pushes forward in a salient. And they need to take the highest point in the forest, which is a place called Hill 400. And Hill 400 is important because artillery observers can, on top of that hill, can pretty much see most of the area in the forest and then plot their artillery accordingly. Germans want it at all costs for that reason, but there's also another reason.
Yes, this is the secret of secrets. Go ahead, Patrick.
One of the greatest secrets of the war at this time is Germany's planned offensive at the Battle of the Bulge. And the hill overlooks the assembly areas of the northern shoulder of the Bulge. This is where the Germans are building up their supplies, their tanks, and their men. And they want to keep Hill 400 at all costs, because if the Allies can see a window into that operation, the secrecy of the operation and the reality of that operation will be blown. It's the secrecy and stealth that the Germans are relying upon as they are about to launch that operation in mid-December. So Hill 400 takes on this amazing importance that the Allies don't even know. But the reserve, the Rangers, are sent to the mission of taking this important.
Take 400. And we're going to go to Hill 400 through Bergstein, the village right below it. Patrick K. O'Donnell, Dog Company, the boys of Pointe-du-Hoc, the Rangers who accomplished D-Day's toughest mission. That's behind them several months. It is now late December. It snows on and off. We're in the Hürtgen forest, which is entirely prepared for a death trap for the Americans. It's part of the Siegfried Line, but most importantly, as Patrick reveals, it allows anyone who moves through the Hürtgen forest to look over the assembly lines for a counterattack that Hitler is about to launch in December against the Allies, the Battle of the Bulge. The Rangers don't know this. We're now in a little town where they're told to reinforce a combat regiment that has been decimated, more than that, essentially reduced to meaninglessness by German counterattacks. Nobody's asking at this point, why are the Germans so fierce about this little town? What's going on here? Instead, they send the Rangers in to capture Hill 400. Patrick, you've done very careful research and you spent a night on Hill 400. Describe what it looks like, what this terrain looks like today.
This is a very substantial and high mount that you can see a large portion of the Hürtgen forest from it. Bergstein is this tiny hamlet below the base of the hill, and right in front of the hill is an old church that is centuries old. And I had the situation of spending the night on Hill 400 by accident, because the inn that I had booked a room in, their credit card machine was out. So I had to find a place to stay. And I went back to the only place I knew, which is Hill 400, because that day I had spent touring Hill 400 as well as the Call Trail with a German paratrooper, two German paratroopers that fought against the Rangers and fought in and around the area. Also a man who was a Fallschirmjäger, or not a Fallschirmjäger, but a part of the German infantry that was there. And that was a remarkable experience to be able to walk in the steps of the men that had fought against the men that I was writing about. We toured it, and the place was covered with mines and artillery and shells that were embedded. And the German military was still excavating live ordnance as we were walking around the area. And so I spent the night in the car on Hill 400, and I actually walked up to the top of the hill, and I never felt just a chill. It felt like the place was completely still haunted. And it's really one of the most remarkable small unit actions of the war. All of the men that I interviewed said to me, Pat, our longest day was not on D-Day, it was at Hill 400. And it's, taking you to December 7th, 1944, and the Rangers have the mission of attacking this hill. The night before, Leonard Lomell, who's the man that disabled 5 of the guns at Point de Hoc, is given a mission by Duke Slater to do a small reconnaissance patrol, 3 or 4 men. And they set out from Bergstein, which is this heavily shelled town that is completely obliterated. There's still Germans inside the town, and they make their way across to the Hill 400, and they find that the hill is really a tough nut to crack. There's minefields on either side. Lomell finds out that the best way to assault the hill is a straight frontal assault across an open field, the size of a football field, basically, at the base of the church. And that's what these men do that morning. And they line up. There's this sort of a sunken road, and they spend the night in Bergstein in the watery cellars of the town's homes, and there's still Germans inside the town. They make their way to the base of the hill where there's this sunken road, and orders are given, rather mysteriously by a newer officer to send out a scout. And many of the men are seasoned Rangers like Petty and Lomell and others. They know that this is a suicide mission, but some guy out in an open field, broad daylight, what's he going to accomplish? And they tell him to stand down. And the newer officer says, it's an order, go across the field. The man goes across the field and he's shot. And this causes these Rangers to be enraged. And they literally, they sort of, as one, a little bit before the time of the assault, like a coiled spring is when Rangers said they sprung from the sunken road, and they charged across the field with fixed bayonets.
Right. Dog Company and Fox Company in line. And you estimate about 120 of them made the charge. Is that right, Patrick?
Right into the teeth of MG-42s, which were in positions around the base of Hill 400 that were dug in. and they bayonet those men, and they charge straight up the hill.
They're screaming like a bunch of Indians is how they remember it.
Yeah, the rebel yell, and then one guy was yelling "Hi ho, Silver," as they charged up this hill, and they charged across the field. They bayoneted anything in their path or shot it. They killed the Germans that were there defending it, and they charged up the hill as quickly as they could. And there was clumps of trees. There were some trees that were still there. And they make their way up to this massive, what's called an observation bunker up the top, and they kill the Germans inside, and they immediately start to dig in on the sides of the hill, and then as well as take the bunker up on the top.
All right, now that they've taken the top of the hill, and they still don't know why the Germans are defending this so ferociously. And when we come back, remember, the Germans always counterattack. In this instance, there are going to be 5 counterattacks over the next day, over the next 40 hours. Patrick K. O'Donnell is the author of Dog Company, The Boys of Pointe du Hoc. D-Day is June 6th. It is now December 7th and 8th. It's snowing lightly on Hill 400, which surprisingly is in the hands of the Ranger assault teams. Down in Bergstein, the Rangers are also holding on from German counterattacks that come from all directions. The commander of Dog Company, Slater, Duke Slater, is down in Bergstein. On Hill 400 is Lieutenant Lomell and what's left of Dog and what's left of Fox. They have an observation post. However, around them on 3 sides are the Germans, to their understanding. Also, raining down on them is every artillery piece in the region that can reach them. They don't know why. Patrick explained why, and it wasn't going to be for several days that America and Britain learned that the Bulge was waiting to counterattack. The German attack that was meant to break the Allies, drive all the way to the port cities, and make the Allies either sue for peace or seek an armistice. So goes the fantasy in the Hitler bunker. We could turn our attention to the Russians to the east. That was the fantasy back in Berlin. But in order to do that, they have to remain secret. And therefore, the Germans have assembled the 272nd Volksgrenadier, armed with MP-44s, really good weapons. The overall commander of this area is Field Marshal Model, who always recovers from mistakes. They also have a German Regiment 980, and very good commander named Adolf Tomai, who's in command of the counterattack. The Germans always counterattack, but 5 counterattacks over the course of 40 hours. Patrick, there's no way this makes sense in a novel. This doesn't happen. It's impossible to imagine holding out.
It is impossible. And the men were dug in on very shallow foxholes. They had their BARs, they had their Tommy guns, they had their M1 Garands, as well as captured German weapons again from each of the subsequent counterattacks. And the artillery is so intense. It's estimated that 15 battalions of artillery conducted a time on target to blow the top of Hills 400 and the sides of Hills 400 with this massive artillery from the German guns. And it was raining down. Lomell told me it was like it was belt fed. That's how intense it was. And men are in these small little shallow foxholes dealing with tree bursts where the shell would hit the top of a tree, and you'd have not only the shrapnel, but also the deadly shards of the wood itself from the tree that would come down in like large knife-like splinters and flay men. They had that, and then they had these counterattacks, and it was the Volksgrenadiers, and it was also this other infantry unit, but also it was buttressed by elite Fallschirmjägers, paratroopers that the Germans had. And they were also using several assault guns, Sturmgeschütz or Stugs, to hit the area in and around Bergstein itself, trying to cut off the hill, decapitate it from the town. And the town itself is being hit by these units as well. And it's just an overwhelming assault. And the men are dug in. And I had one account that I found in the archives by Secor, who was a sergeant, and he literally took, after several of the waves of these German attacks, he took some captured MP40s, and in either hand was charging down the hill with the MP40s in either hands, almost something like out of Where Eagles Dare with Clint Eastwood. It's an amazing scene. And then that was confirmed not only in the written record, but also from several eyewitnesses that I had interviewed. But that was how desperate things were. They were using captured weapons, hand grenades, anything that they could with their M1 Garands and BARs to fend off these Germans. And things were getting very, very precarious and hairy. Many of the men retreated to the top of the command bunker. Many men were wounded. And after several of these ferocious assaults and this overwhelming artillery, which is nonstop, Lomell looked at the situation. The Rangers were down in strength. There was one counterattack coming after another, and it was proposed potentially. There was a thought of surrender, and the men universally said, no, we must not surrender under any circumstances. And it was a fight to the death. And they continue to hold out.
Yeah, Len Lomell called them together. He's wounded again. Everybody's shot. He's got a bleeding hand, and this is your reporting, Patrick. This is 4:06 p.m. on the 7th or the 8th. Is this the 8th or the 7th? It's the
7th.
It's the 7th. 4:06 p.m. on the 7th, local time. And he calls them together and says, the Germans take
Might have been the 8th. I'm sorry.
The 8th.
Yeah,
the 8th. The Germans take good care of our casualties. So if we surrender, they will treat the wounded who are dying. They're dying around him. And my note here says there are 40 men total on the hillside at this point. And they reject the idea of surrendering. We got here, we're going to stay here. And Lomell calls back to Slater and says, you've got to send us reinforcements. You have to. But the Germans are not going to wait. They're going to continue to counterattack. Many years later, one of them returns to Hill 40 during a tour, 1989, right, many years later. And he runs into German military academy students. And what do they tell him, Patrick?
You'll have to sort of flesh that out a little bit more.
All right. They tell him that we've been taught that you outnumbered the counterattackers, and that the reason the Hill 400 held was because the German army didn't bring enough offensive power to break through the Ranger forces. And so as late as 1989, and maybe, Patrick, they've got your book now, so they've corrected it.
Really? Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, the Germans overwhelmingly, with massive numbers of forces, overwhelmingly had the numbers on the Rangers. And yeah, this small group of determined men, against all odds, hold out.
At 5:45, Slater finally puts together a platoon, a reinforcing platoon. He grabs mortar teams. He grabs anybody who can carry a rifle, and they charge up 400, and that breaks the German will. Apparently, after that, the Germans don't mount any more counterattacks. Hill 400 is held. The Rangers have held, but no one still puts together what they can see from the top of Hill 400. Is that correct, Patrick?
That's correct. The information is they see, assembly of men, material, equipment, and it's reported to the chain of command. But like so many other intelligence failures in so many other wars, nobody connects the dots. The intelligence doesn't go up to the right people. And on December 16th, 1944, the Germans, this is a couple weeks after Hill 400, the Germans launch the great counteroffensive of the war, and they attain complete surprise.
They overwhelm the way the story is told is that the Americans army, which was always heavily well armed with lots of people, are putting in fresh troops to the front line because this is a quiet sector of the battle line. And they expect that the regular troops, the ones that have been up front, need R&R, so they're rotated back. And the Germans strike at the weak point where the Americans are freshest and overwhelmed, and there's a massive surrender because they're surrounded. The Germans then, with major armor, cut through all the way, and that's the Battle of Bastogne. That's going to be the point where the German offensive breaks down. But that's several days from now. In the meantime, the Rangers are assigned a point, which Patrick describes as a tip of the spear, to break the German attack. Importantly, our hero, Len Lomell, who held out on top 400, is now rotated back to the US. And his good friend, Jack Kuhn, now comes back in as the NCO of Dog Company, as the first sergeant of Dog Company. Len Lomell never returns to the battlefront because the war will be over, in another 6 months. He recovers in Pennsylvania, I believe, at the Valley Forge Hospital.
Very, very heavily wounded from the attack on Hill 400. And the Rangers are in a defensive position in the so-called northern shoulder. It's here that the 82nd Airborne and other units hold off the SS. And then you have a little further to the south, the other focus is at Bastogne. 101st is surrounded along with other, an assortment of armor units and others hold out. And Hitler changes his objective to Bastogne, and they continue to hold out until Patton's army is able to break through. And then it's a month-long slog in the Bulge to reduce that salient that has occurred, that the Germans have created.
The Rangers are not done, of course. They're used again and again, but the war is going to end in May of 1945. And when we come back, we're going to turn to Patrick's conversations with the survivors of Dog Company, the survivors of the 2nd Ranger Battalion in the early parts of the 21st century. The book is Dog Company, The Boys of Pointe-du-Hoc, the Rangers who accomplished D-Day's toughest mission and led the way across Europe. They survived D-Day. They survived Hill 400. Very few of them, however, are available to talk to in the early part of the 21st century. Patrick has an enormous library of facts that he's assembled, oral histories over the years. And he came to writing this book thanks to Len Lomell and others, because they are the remaining memories of Dog Company. Let's go to where Len Lomell and you had your talk. This was in southern Jersey, early part of this century. Is that right, Patrick?
Yes. It was a situation where, books find me. I've written 13 books, 7 on World War II and other wars. And books have a tendency to find me. And that was certainly the case where I happened to be in that area. And I'll never forget, I was eating pizza that night, and I said to myself, what is my next good book going to be? And I'm near the Monmouth battlefield, and I decided to give Len Lomell a call without any real prep. And I said, I'd known him for years. So do you mind if I stop by? Sure, it's an absolute, Pat. And I went to his home, and we watched Mets game, we watched a baseball game. And he's like, what's your next book going to be? And I said, I'm not sure, Len. He said, Dog Company, Pat. You should tell the story of Dog Company. And that for me was a tremendous honor to be asked to tell their story, which is such an incredible story. It's a story about men that literally bent, shaped history, that were in some of the great inflection points of the war. And I had known Len since the mid-90s, along with my other great friend, Sidney Solomon, who was at Point de la Place. They led that attack, the other force against the mortars, and many, many of these other men, which it was a real honor to have that assignment, if you will, a mission to bring to life the story of Dog Company. And I interviewed all of the survivors. I had Len's personal notes from D-Day on our casualties and other special, things that he had saved. He was a lawyer after the war, and just highly respected man, an American that was just really a remarkable friend. That's the way most of these men for Dog Company and the Rangers in general, as well as I've interviewed thousands of World War II veterans, from the OSS, hundreds there, to Merrill's Marauders, First Special Service Force, the Airborne, all the 82nd, 101st, all the independent units like the 551st, 509, any elite unit in American history. I've, at least in World War II and before that, my other books have really touched upon, as well in modern war as well. And it's been a really, really great honor.
Slater, the commander of Dog Company, he stays in the Army and he fights in Korea. And he's captured. He's a POW and then comes back out. Did he leave the Army afterwards?
Yeah, he retires from it. But Duke is a very mysterious figure. No one from Dog Company really had, from his experience in Korea onward, he really kept his distance from anyone from World War II. And it was through Len and others that I was able to piece together Duke Slater's really remarkable story as well. And then it was the other family members, as well as the other surviving veterans of Dog Company, that I was able to take their oral histories, spent a lot of time at the National Archives to look at the original documents that were generated from the 2nd Ranger Battalion, the Corps, etc. And then also the German side, I was able to weave in that story through their accounts in their original documentation.
James Rudder, the commander who first received the orders of the impossible mission, you note he becomes president of Texas A&M University. So
yeah, Rudder is a really remarkable figure, because Rudder is, in many ways, that the 2nd Ranger Battalion is a mirror of him. He's a football coach. He's a very inspiring individual that we didn't get into it, but the night before D-Day, the commanding officer finds out the exact details of the mission, because he had been kept in the dark, and gets drunk that night. And he literally goes on a tirade and says that this is a suicide mission that we will not succeed with. And Rudder relieves him on the spot. And he's quite a courageous man. He later receives a Distinguished Service Cross in another unit, but he's no longer a Ranger. And what Rudder is forced to do is take command of the assault force on Pointe du Hoc that day, which strips him of the overall Ranger commander. And because he's got to lead the assault. Had he not led the assault personally, I think it probably would have potentially failed. He was so motivating and so on the ground with all the details, and so important, as such a figure to be there, leads the assault and keeps the men intact from a mission that probably should have failed because they were being overwhelmed by German numbers.
Ruggiero, the most colorful character of all.
One of my great friends. Yeah.
He becomes a firefighter in Plymouth, Massachusetts.
Yes. He was just a great friend. He was a great friend of Len's that I befriended. And, for me, John, the greatest tribute is when these men tell me that this was their book. And that was certainly the case with, his nickname was Reggie, and he loved this book. He was personally doing book signings and everything else in Plymouth. It was the greatest thing in the world. And he would tell me and all of his friends about how he was so proud of Dog Company. And he has such a remarkable story. He comes in as the shortest man in the battalion, regiment, and the company. And he's a tap dancer before the war, he's a performer, and is just a remarkable figure of courage and leadership, and later becomes a fire chief up in Plymouth. Just an amazing guy.
Ronald Reagan, his speech in 1984, the 40th anniversary, pointed to the boys at Pointe-du-Hoc, and it is his best speech, Patrick. I'm not going to say
I agree.
His best speech now that it's these many years later. And it wasn't just them he was talking about, but he used them as an example of the risk, the dare, and the sacrifice on D-Day. And we just have 30 seconds, Patrick. It's these many years later, and they're all gone. Are they remembered? Do you travel the country and find people asking about them? We just have
absolutely. And at that speech, there's really a remarkable thing happens. Herman Stein, who's with Petty throughout the experience, he's one of the main characters in this book. He's on Hill 400 in a foxhole, shell foxhole, fights off all these Germans. He is a roofer,
right.
And they reenact the scaling of the cliffs with the modern Rangers. And he asks if he can go. And he climbs up the cliff before everybody else that day. And he's in his 70s. And he's greeted by President Reagan. That's just it. It's a tribute to the spirit of America,
right,
and the resilience of America, and the can-do nature of being able to small individuals or group of individuals that can shape and change history.
Well, the boys of Pointe-du-Hoc Dog Company, Patrick K. O'Donnell. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.